Hi everyone, welcome back to Poetology. I want to talk about the Forward Prize for Poetry, which is the main prize for poetry in the UK. They have published their shortlist for best collections, and I wanted to read each and every one of them and talk about them ahead of the prize ceremony, which will be on the 10th of October. The Forward Prize has been working since 1992, and they have prizes for best collections and best single poems. And this year, the 5 shortlisted books are God Complex by Rachel Allen, brackets by Fadi Judah, Good Lord by Ella Frears, Strike by Sarah Wimbush, and With My Back to the World by Victoria Chang. I'm going to talk about them in the order that I've read them, and then at the end I will try to predict which of them might win the prize. The first one I read was Strike by Sarah Wimbush, and this is one that is published by a small publisher, which is Stairwell Books in York. It contains a lot of pictures from the miners' strikes in the 1980s, and in fact, each poem refers back to a picture. It's not always a very direct correlation. Sometimes it talks about a character in the picture or the general event that is described, and at other times it's a little more tangential, but it's always related. And thanks to those pictures, you get a pretty good idea of the events that were taking place at the time, even if your knowledge of the strikes is maybe not very detailed. There are also a few notes at the end to help with context in some instances. Some of these pictures are very iconic, like this one, and others I'd never seen, but then I'm probably not the most informed when it comes to British history and politics. I'm still learning to make my way through it all. It felt like a history in poems. We have historical fiction, and this is historical poetry. There were lots of regional words or more colloquial words used, which gave the language texture, and a lot of names and specific places, so that it was very anchored in the time and place. The strikes described took place in Sheffield, in Wales, in Yorkshire, and a few other places. The poetry itself was lively and inspired, and it really draws you into that world. It felt like the collection had a strong story arc, not just a strong focus, but a strong development over the course of those strikes and across various geographical locations. It made me look up some information, and it made me want to know more about the strikes, and it also left quite a strong and lasting impression after reading. I kept thinking about this collection, and I'm still thinking about it quite a bit. So I thought it was very, very strong. Occasionally, in just a few of the poems, I wasn't entirely happy with the last line, which I found slightly trite, but I'm really looking for details here because overall it's a very, very strong collection. I was happy to see the poster here for the fundraising event in London, Pits and Perverts. That was when lesbians and gays supported the miners by raising money, and all the proceeds went to the South Wales miner community who were striking. I'd seen this on a t-shirt at the London bookshop Gaze the Word, and I had a vague idea of what it related to, but I didn't know the details. So that was an interesting thing for me to see and have more insight into. So this was a really interesting poetry collection that I thought was lively, very readable, and intensely topical, very focused on this historical moment and the impact of the strikes on miner communities. Next, I read this collection by Fadi Judah, which has ... in brackets as the title, and in fact many of the poems are also titled the same, but not all. As you can imagine from the colors of the cover, this is a Palestinian poet living in the US, And again, most of these poems are about Palestine. It did feel almost like a continuum, even though the poems were separate, most of them just 1 page long. It also felt like I was reading a longer narrative, fragmented perhaps, but nonetheless on topic. The poetry itself was really alive and felt soaked through with grief, sometimes uncomfortable when the speaker uses you, which seems to address the reader, but maybe referring to some other people, when that you was used in an accusatory tone or felt critical, it could feel a little jarring, but I think in a good way, in a way that provoked more feeling and was conducive to the overall message of the collection. The poet really likes repetition with slight variations, so a repetition of words with a slightly different arrangement or repetition of sounds in the poem, sometimes a line that comes back. There was a lot of play with that. Some of the poem titles made reference to Arabic music, to a vocal melodic type of improvisation within traditional music called makam. And so it's not difficult to draw a link between those repetitions, sometimes in the poems, and the sounds that are created, the sort of rhythmic sounds that the poems themselves perform. There was also plenty of natural imagery, descriptions of people and relationships, and transformation from one state to another, which means that not all of it was about war. It was also about hope, it was about love, and it was about joy as much as it was about the destruction of war. And obviously all of these things are woven together. Judah is a doctor, and sometimes you can tell from the description or the way he writes about the human body that he knows, although it's always done in a very poetic fashion, never in an overtly scientific one. There was a poem towards the end titled Dedication that felt really powerful. It dedicates the poem to those who were killed or will be killed, as well as opening it up then to other dimensions. So this was another really strong collection with a very timely, important topic, and I really enjoyed it and will likely reread it. Then comes Good Lord by Ella Frears. This is quite innovative because it's written as an email, and it's not a short email, it's a 215-page email to a landlord. The concept is that the speaker's landlords have partnered with a property technology company called GOODLORD and are inviting the speaker to renew their rental contracts online. And that starts a very, very long email to the estate agent Ava. And then the email is obviously about renting, but from there it goes all over the place to all the places where the speaker has lived before, the places where she has worked, and all the places where she has stayed for any length of time. At the same time, it also talks about sex and relationships, including sexual harassment and the body itself as property, since GOODLORD also talks about this idea of renting versus ownership, and this includes ownership of the female body by men. And it also has ghosts, which I wasn't expecting, but that was one of my favorite parts. So the presence of the past in rented spaces. When you rent a space, other people have been there before you, and so this idea of ghosting also was very thought-provoking. My favorite part was the artist's residency, which took up a good 30 pages. Ella Frears is a visual artist as well as a poet, and so I imagine this is inspired by her own experience doing residencies, but that was absolutely hilarious. The way that she writes is bold, it's brazen, it's kind of cool, and the tone was pretty straightforward and conversational, but it was quite stylish, and the poetic lines looked like this on the page. Most of the book was written in that format, and so despite the tone some of the words and some of the phrases make it distinctively poetic. Otherwise, it reads almost like a novel. It feels novel-like and almost overlaps with a creative memoir in terms of genre. And so as a collection, I thought it was humorous, irreverent, and it was also quite a sharp critique of ownership, especially landlords, and all the issues around tenancy. This book, I think, out of all 5, was probably the one that felt the freshest, like it was doing something new. It's something I haven't seen before. A poem as an email. I've seen short email poems, but this is a really long one. And the way that it overlaps with the memoir genre and other aspects of it made it really new and refreshing. Then I read Victoria Chang, With My Back to the World. This one is an ekphrastic collection. It is inspired by the work of Agnes Martin. And let's be honest, I don't know much about the artist Agnes Martin, so I was reading this book and taking it at face value. The aspect that was most interesting to me was the artwork next to the poems. In part 1 and part 3, next to some of the poems, there is an artistic erasure of that same poem, and often there is a transparent layer added and then some lines on top, like this here. Here, for example, there are vertical lines placed on the entire text, and then you get the readable version here. This wasn't always the case. Many of the poems were just on their own, but I really loved these erasures. Here too, you can see the entire poem has been blacked out, but in a way that looks photocopied and a bit faded. That was my favorite aspect of this collection. The poetry itself is somewhat abstract and evocative, and it has lots of phrases that just stick with you. Some really striking phrases that you want to remember and want to write down and reread later on. I've got one here. We are tenants of language. We are leaving while writing. Many of them are, as I said, encounter with artworks, and you can see, for example, here the title is Untitled Number 10, 2002, and this one is Friendship, 1963. So these seem to be quite clearly artworks that are being referred to in the title. And then the poem itself wanders a little more broadly. It's not a description of the piece or anything too literal, but it goes beyond and sometimes talks directly to the artist to discuss some themes. And some of these themes that came again and again were depression, grief, and solitude. There was also an obsession with counting, number of lines, classification, rectangles, boxes, measures, grids, etc. And I don't know if these are aspects of the artist's work or not, because I don't know the artist well enough, but there were many references to the lines, especially penciled lines, that are still visible under the brush strokes of Agnes Martin. And it made me think about how both art and poems work with lines. And I think that's one of the main aspects that drew me to this collection, is just this exploration of lines and rectangles and forms through poetry, but also at the same time how whimsical some of it was. As these explorations went on, you could see that the life of the poet, or at least the speaker, and the life of the artist were merging. And often the speaker was speaking about her own life rather than an artwork. I also had a big crush on part 2 in the middle of the book, because that part is like a poetic diary. And I've spoken about poetic diaries before. You can watch this video if you're interested. And here there was what looks like an original diary, but with an entry blacked out. And then you had the transposition on the right-hand side that went on for several pages. And this diary consisted of daily entries for a couple of months or so, and they were all referring to a father dying at the hospital and the aftermath of his passing. So again, pretty impressive collection here by Victoria Chang. And finally, I read Rachel Allen's God Complex. This collection explores a violent relationship and breakup in parallel to the environment and its weather and tempers. It tackles the question of murdered women, of domestic violence, and intergenerational patterns of abuse. And when it talked about weather, it talked especially about water, rivers, sludge, also soil, minerals, mold, sky, clouds, weather patterns. In terms of God complex, the God complex sometimes refers to the speaker and sometimes to her ex. There was more religious imagery in the last part of the collection, where the speaker mentions the worship condition, for example. This idea of worshipping someone to the degree of losing any rational thought and just going totally beyond yourself into the relationship to the point where you lose who you are and struggle to rebuild yourself afterwards because of this obsessive quality that came with the relationship. The collection also explores the different houses that the couple lived in and what happened to those houses, again mixed in with flooding and other elements of the natural world. Especially in the last part, the question of viruses and contagion, disintegration, and toxicity became more prevalent, and through it all, the connections between people. It made me think of how things like contagion and toxicity always involve several agents and sort of link people together. Maybe the pandemic made that obvious, that through COVID we were all one big global community because we could all transmit and receive the virus. But yes, this idea of toxicity, disintegration is not actually so individualistic. It is more of a communal issue here, and everyone is interconnected. Another recurring theme was fertility as well. The question of fertility and whether it's possible. I would say this one, and perhaps Ella Frears as well, were the ones that discussed feminism a bit more head-on. So now, in terms of who I think will win, well, that's complicated. All of these collections have a very clear focus, a very clear line and purpose that they achieve within the collection. All of them are extremely well written, of course. All of them are political in some way. Most of them had elements of feminism, which was perhaps most obvious in Ella Frears and Rachel Allen, and to an extent also Victoria Chang, and maybe a couple of poems by Sarah Wimbush. And they're all very bold in what they try to achieve and the way that they get there. They've all tried to do something that is fairly new. This one was very topical, talking about a historical event. This one is also extremely timely, talking about Palestine and war and grief. This one had a very delicate way and touching way of talking about art and depression. I really liked how innovative this one was, and God Complex kind of has this sweeping quality that I find hard to express. I feel like I need to reread it to understand it better, and I feel like one of these two is likely to win. I don't know if I'm right about that, but I think they are the most likely to win. Now, it's very difficult to say which one. Maybe part of me is just thinking this one might win just because it's doing something different. At the same time, this is really excellent. It's already published by Faber. I don't know. And that is not to say anything negative about these three, because they were also absolutely amazing. And so it's very difficult to say who will win. I would recommend all of them, let's be fair. If anything caught your attention, let me know in the comments below. and we will see soon enough who the actual winner is. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one very soon. Bye!